I'm about to tell you and discuss the craziest story connected to Canadian politics that you might not be aware of. So, Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, has enacted a referendum that's going to take place in the fall, I believe. And this referendum is to decide if there should be another referendum which will be on the topic of Albertan independence. Now, I'll forgive you if you don't know where Alberta is or what I'm talking about. So, Alberta is a province in Canada. And in terms of population, it's, I think, the fourth largest province after Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. And if Alberta was a US state, it would rank, I think, 26th in terms of population because there's almost 5 million. So it would rank below Alabama and above Louisiana. So that's the kind of population we're talking about when we talk about Alberta. So the reason this came to my mind is I was reading a story about this, and of course, there are Facebook groups that are discussing this topic, and people are very rational in those groups, as you can imagine. But what's happening, it's not just foreign countries who are trying to make this referendum a real thing, like the United States and Trump's government. Thanks, buddy. And also, Putin, I believe, wants to do this as well. But it's also just normal people because Meta, the owners of Facebook, have this policy now where you can be monetized according to how engaged your posts are. So if people see your posts and react to your posts and look at ads on your posts, Meta will give you money. So a lot of these people who have been using AI pro separation posters and stuff are not even located in Canada. They're located in Sri Lanka. They're located in foreign countries, which is a thing that happens now, right? So the important thing is not about the merits of the issue. It's more about engagement. Engagement triumphs over everything. So obviously that's ridiculous. And I think I checked the CBC for the likelihood of the referendum in September or in the fall passing. So the referendum to have another referendum. And the likelihood is about 50%. So Albertans want the chance to decide. But then when you ask them, do they support independence? The answer is no. And I think there's many facets to this that I find really interesting. And I am not a knee-jerk a reactionary when it comes to the topic of Canadian and American unification. I think it does make a lot of sense, but I think if it's going to happen, it needs to happen on Canadian terms. So there would need to be another referendum all across Canada asking everybody, do you want to dissolve Canada, right? And do you want to dissolve Canada into independent provinces? And then if the answer is yes, the Federation of Canada dissolves, and those little provinces are now independent. I mean, I say little, some would be like super little, like the size of Rhode Island, but some would be huge, like bigger than Texas. And I know Americans, nothing is bigger than Texas, but yes, there are things that are bigger than Texas. I think Ontario and Quebec would be bigger than Texas. Yeah, and then they could decide. So Quebec could decide if it wanted to join the United States. Alberta could decide if it wanted to join the United States, etc., etc. So I think that's the way you would have to do it if you wanted it to happen, because any other way is going to cause a lot of conflict. So I was thinking about this Alberta referendum, and I was wondering, like, what would happen. So as I said, the likelihood of Albertans actually declaring independence in the second referendum is very, very small. But what happens if they do declare independence? I think we have to look at different scenarios. I think if we look at, let's say, I mean, not even that they do declare independence. What happens if the referendum like gets a majority of people who voted? Let's say they get 51%. There's a couple scenarios. Like one, they just barely win, and the second, it's a landslide. All of Albertans want to be independent. So I think in the first one, it really depends on who's the premier at the time, what the reaction will be. Because if I were the premier and it was 51%, but the turnout was less than 50%, I would say, oh, yep, the people spoke, but not enough people spoke. We are just going to stay in Canada because my conscience can't let me take Alberta out. I think the current premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, she's really, really pro-Trump. So, and she's stated that she doesn't want Alberta to leave Canada, but I think that she might be tempted in that situation to declare independence. But so it just depends on who's in control in Alberta when the election happens. And the reaction to a declaration of independence, I think, is really... That's an interesting point too. So maybe I'll get to that in a bit. But what happens if there's like an overwhelming majority of votes and an overwhelming majority of people in Alberta voted for independence? Then it gets kind of interesting. So the premier would have to declare independence. But the thing is, there's no mechanism for a province to leave Canada. And I kind of don't like that argument, like, oh, it's not in the Constitution, so the country needs to stay together forever. But if we think about the recent past, there are countries that used that argument. Like there was a referendum in Catalonia where the nationalist movement, they had a referendum and the yes vote for independence won. And the reason it won is because the Spanish, I don't want to say nationalists because they weren't really nationalists, but they like the no vote generally stayed home because they were Spanish speakers. So the yes vote won, but they won a majority of votes cast by people who were Catalans. And so they declared independence, but the Spanish government basically said, yeah, no, that's illegal. You can't do that. And I think in the case of Canada, that's exactly what would happen too. Because there is no mechanism for Alberta to be independent. And if you picture a map of Canada, Alberta's not exactly in the middle, but it's close. So you have British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So if you just took Alberta right out of Canada, it would leave this long strip of the coast, which would be very odd. It would be aesthetically not pleasing. So that's one reason against it. But like the reasons why it wouldn't happen are, one, it would be illegal. There's no mechanism in the Constitution granting independence. There's no way for a province to leave. And the reason that is because of Quebec. Because if there was a mechanism for Quebec to leave, Quebec would have left already. And, Quebec did have 2 referendums on the subject of independence, and they lost. And they lost for a similar reason like the Catalans won, which is The Quebecois generally voted a majority to leave, and the English speakers of Quebec voted a majority to stay. So if you took all of that plus the Quebecois who voted to stay, that would be a majority of the inhabitants of Quebec. So it's illegal for Alberta to leave. So I think the premier, like I think if it was the first option where the majority of the people who voted in the referendum voted, but it was like 51% and there wasn't the majority of people voting, then I think, as I said, the premier would just say, no, we're not going to do it. And if they did decide to do it, I think that they probably would be arrested because the federal government has more power than the provincial governments. And I think even with 90% of the... So that's where it gets more interesting because theoretically, if they voted 90% to leave Canada, then the Canadian government would be in a position where they could say no, but it would look really, really, really bad. And them saying no would open a big can of worms. I mean, like the referendum would open a big can of worms anyway. The can would already be open at that time. So basically, the government wouldn't have any good options. So they would either arrest the leadership of the provincial government or let them start to negotiate to be independent. And this is where it gets super interesting because, as I said, Alberta is a landlocked province in the middle of the continent. And the reasons that they want to be independent, or that they don't want to be independent, but the reasons why people make the argument for independence are basically three. One is because Alberta pays more to Ottawa in terms of taxes than it gets from Ottawa. And Quebec and Ontario also are like, yeah, welcome to the club, and British Columbia. So basically, you have some areas of the country that are super, super wealthy and some areas of the country that are not that wealthy. And the areas of the country that are super wealthy are supporting the areas that are not super wealthy. So Albertans don't like that. They kind of resent that. So that's one reason. The second reason is theoretically Alberta is in control of its natural resources, but Canadian federalism works the way that the federal government is responsible for interprovincial infrastructure. So if they want to build a pipeline to ship their oil from the oil sands to different places, the federal government can say no. And they have before. And they've also done things in the past like nationalize the petroleum industry, which Alberta did not like. And the last reason is that because of the two reasons previous, they feel like they need more of a say in like the direction of Canada. But what happens if the referendum succeeds? So they start a process of negotiation with the federal government, and they will demand things like, we want access to federal money for, schools and roads and transportation. We want access to federal markets. We want access to the Canadian dollar. We don't want to have our own independent dollar. Because basically they would want to have what they have now. They'd want a customs union with Canada and potentially with the United States. So generally, they would want those things, but the rest of Canada is not going to be in a mood to provide them. Because one, they could have said no. They could have declared this whole thing illegal, but they didn't. They were forced into the corner. And so they're not going to agree to a common currency. They're not going to agree to free trade, at least at first. Think about what happened when the UK left the EU. like there was this big reaction against that from the other EU countries, and they wanted to make it difficult for the UK because of the choice that they made, and they also wanted to make it clear to other members of the EU that there are consequences to leaving, right? So this would be the first province ever to have left Canada, so the consequences I think would be pretty extreme. And so you would basically be trapped in this landlocked country, getting poorer and poorer. And then what happens? And I think in what the Albertan separatists are not saying is that, and then what happens is that they would be taken over by the United States. But that is I think that's the general gist of why Alberta separatism is a thing in the first place, is because they want to create a situation where Canada falls apart and the United States can pick up the pieces. But imagine like you voted for Albertan separatism in like legitimately you thought you should have your own country, and then like 10 years later you're a part of the United States. You're still paying more taxes than other states because, as I said, it would be the 25th largest state by population in the United States. Certainly it wouldn't be paying as much as California and New York and Texas, but it would be in the top 25, 50% of states. So they still would have province, assuming that they still have oil and all of that. And that's even thinking if the United States accepts this, right? Because on the one hand, if you're America, you might be like, gobble, 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 gobble. And I really think it depends on who's leading the country. But the United States also has areas that it doesn't want to lose, right? So if it says its nearest neighbor can fall apart and we'll gobble up the pieces, what's to say that Puerto Rico can't be independent, right? Or Hawaii, right? Because those are a lot more colonial projects than Alberta is. So I think that the United States government actually wouldn't annex Alberta because it would open a can of worms in the United States. Plus, there's a lot of other reasons why they wouldn't annex Alberta, because then if you annex Alberta, you would have to give them statehood at least, right? Because if you don't, then you have this territory and people would be very unhappy there. They did want statehood. And so if you give Alberta statehood, you have to give Puerto Rico statehood, right? Right? So you're going to have more senators. And like, you would think that Alberta, being one of the most conservative provinces in Canada, would be like very attractive to Republicans because they would want to have a majority. But like, if Alberta, I don't even think that Alberta necessarily would be Republican, because Canadian politics is completely different. And I didn't talk about this yet, but Alberta has this long history of doing very odd things like social credit, which was basically, universal basic income before that was trendy. So I think Alberta in the United States would not go as wonderfully as some American Republicans might dream, because they imagine it's like Texas. It's a little bit like Texas. So I think that there are other reasons why Albertan independence would fail. Like, Alberta doesn't have a militia, and Canada as a country is a union of provinces, yes, but this union was created in a time when Canada wasn't even independent. So it's not like the provinces have like more rights than the federal government. Like, no, it's like the federal government, and there are certain things in the Constitution that are that are written down, but as I said, independence isn't one of them. And I think if there's a situation where 51% of the people who vote, and the people who vote are like 25%, and the federal government or the premier of Alberta says no, I don't think anybody wants to take up arms for the glorious cause of Albertan independence. You know, I don't see it happening. I think it's interesting. It's a really interesting phenomenon because it's like a combination of Canada's problems, because Canada is this unexpected empire, right? Like a lot of how Canada exists is just because Canada inherited British North America for the most part. So we have all of this legacy of all of these colonial projects, and no one ever agreed to being part of Canada. When Canada was created, as I said, it wasn't independent, it was a colony. And so it was members of the English-speaking establishment that created the country. And Alberta, for example, I think didn't become a province until I think 19. Really, I don't remember. But it wasn't like a province that sprung into being and joined Canada. It was more like Canada existed. There was like this Northwest Territories, and Alberta was kind of taken out of the Northwest Territories. Kind of like what happened in the United States. But Canada has never had a civil war to determine whether states can leave or provinces can leave. So yeah, I don't think it will happen, but I don't know. Like, on the one hand, it's kind of like wild to imagine a time where Alberta is independent and Ontario is independent, and that's one scenario that I don't think a lot of people would consider ever to happen, because what we think would happen if Canada fell apart is that it would be annexed by the United States. But I think it all depends on how it falls apart, because if it falls apart in a way that there are like independence referendums and people declare independence, and then Alberta's independent, Quebec is independent, Ontario is independent. So I think, as I said before, I think Americans might say no. Like, no, you can't have an independence referendum because Puerto Rico and Hawaii can't have it. Texas can't have it. So I think it would take generations for the project of unification to happen if it happened that way. And I know I said that would be the way that unification would happen in between Canada and the United States. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting topic. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. All right. Bye-bye.